That evening, as I stood in the kitchen setting the table, the warm, comforting smell of fried chicken sizzling in the pan mixed with the earthy scent of freshly cooked potatoes. These familiar aromas filled the air, wrapping around the room like a cozy blanket. The soft hum of conversation and the light chatter of the evening made everything feel normal, like any other typical night in our home. Emily and I had been married for years, and in that time, I thought I'd come to know every little detail of our life together, the routines, the rhythms, the unspoken comfort of our shared moments. It all felt predictable, safe, and steady. Or at least, that's what I thought, until he showed up. Ryan. Emily's friend. The one I'd always brushed off as just that, her friend. I'd seen him come and go over the years, never thinking much about him beyond the usual jokes and small talk between old buddies. But that night, something felt different. The moment he walked into the room, the warm, easy atmosphere shifted, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I noticed his gaze first. It was subtle, just a flicker, a quick glance, but it didn't go unnoticed. It felt like his eyes were on me even when I wasn't looking. When our eyes accidentally met, something stirred inside me, a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. There was something unsettled in his expression, but it was masked by this strange innocence, like he didn't even realize what he was doing. The longer I stood there, the more I felt his presence wasn't just a passing thing. It was like he was quietly changing the energy of the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to brush it off, to focus on my usual routine, setting the plates, arranging the silverware, bringing out the food. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something had shifted. Ryan was laughing now, his voice easy and full of life as he and Emily traded jokes. But it wasn't just his laughter that pulled me in. It was the way he carried himself, this effortless confidence, this magnetic energy that seemed to fill the room. He wasn't just another person in the conversation, it felt like he was part of something bigger, something unspoken that neither Emily nor I could fully grasp. But I couldn't ignore it. Every time I looked up from what I was doing, my eyes somehow met his again. And with each glance, that strange sensation came rushing back, a quiet undercurrent of tension, like an invisible thread pulling at something deep inside me. I couldn't explain it, but it was there, hovering just beneath the surface. It was like the air between us had changed, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of it in a way I hadn't been before. Ryan was younger than Emily and me, always so full of energy and laughter. But there was a depth to him that seemed beyond his years. He had this carefree, almost reckless confidence that could make you feel both drawn to him and wary of him at the same time. It wasn't that I found him attractive in the traditional sense, not like some crush or anything like that. But there was something about him that unsettled me deeply. It wasn't just his smile or the way his laughter lit up the room. It was something more profound, an energy that seemed to wrap around me in a way I couldn't define. I wasn't looking for anything, but Ryan's presence in the room was undeniably potent, and it left me confused. As the evening went on, I tried to keep things normal. I poured the wine, passed around the plates of food, made small talk. But every time I glanced in his direction, his eyes were waiting for mine. It was like we were drawn into these brief, unspoken connections, looks that lasted just a little too long. Each time our eyes met, it felt like the world around me slowed down, the noise fading into the background. All I could focus on was the intensity of that quiet exchange. I'd look away first, but it didn't help. My heart would race, this odd flutter sending a wave of heat through me. Emily, completely oblivious to what was happening right in front of her, was busy chatting with someone else, unaware of the silent tension that had settled between Ryan and me. The more I tried to push it away, the more palpable the energy between us became. It felt like something was building in the room, a tension that was almost visible, like a storm waiting to break. Ryan moved through the evening with this effortless charm, his magnetic presence drawing everyone in. He was the life of the party, the one who could lighten any mood with a joke or a smile. But the way he carried himself, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long, made me feel like I was the only one in the room he was really paying attention to. He wasn't the kind of person I could flirt with, not that I ever would. But the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me, the weight of his presence, it all seemed to pull me in against my will. It wasn't obvious, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something in the way he made me feel that unsettled me to my core. Every word he said, every glance he threw my way, felt like it carried a hidden layer of meaning, something I wasn't prepared for. Every time our eyes met, the world seemed to hold its breath. His gaze didn't falter, and I couldn't seem to look away, even though I knew I should. It was like a quiet battle, my heart racing every time his gaze caught mine, and yet I couldn't stop myself from falling into it. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing moment, that there was no reason for it to affect me this way. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't control, something that was quietly shifting the ground beneath my feet. Even though I was still standing in the same kitchen, surrounded by the same people, everything about our life, the life I thought I knew, felt suddenly fragile, teetering on the edge of something new, something unexpected, something I hadn't fully understood yet. It was silly, right? I had to be imagining things. Ryan was just Emily's friend. That was it. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The air was thick with something unsaid, something that felt as inevitable as it was dangerous. I needed a moment to breathe. The kitchen had become too crowded, too warm. I stepped out onto the balcony, a glass of wine in my hand, feeling the cool night air wash over me, calming the tightness in my chest. I told myself I was just tired, just overwhelmed by the noise and the energy. But I knew better. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. I had to keep reminding myself of who I was, a wife, someone grounded in the life I'd built with Emily. But then I felt it. That presence. Ryan was standing beside me, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the kitchen light behind him. I hadn't heard him come out. It was like he'd just appeared out of thin air, silent and sudden. "You look a little off," he said, his voice warm and low, with a teasing edge that felt too familiar. I forced a smile, trying to play it cool. "I'm just tired," I replied, taking a sip of my wine, the glass cool against my fingers. But he wasn't buying it. His eyes studied me too intently, like he could see right through the lie I'd just told. "You're not tired," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It's something else." I laughed lightly, hoping to brush it off. "I don't know what you mean." Ryan didn't smile. His eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, analyzing. "It's like you're somewhere else," he said, his tone serious now. "Like there's something you're holding back." I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off again, but I couldn't. His words hit too close to the truth. There was something I was holding back, something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. It felt so strong, so undeniable now. I tried to pull myself together, to regain control of the conversation, but it was like trying to hold on to water, it just slipped through my fingers. He took a step closer, and the space between us seemed to shrink with every second. I could feel the heat of his presence, his gaze still fixed on me. It was like he was daring me to admit something I wasn't ready to face. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice wavered slightly. But he wasn't buying it. He didn't need me to say anything more. His eyes told me he already knew. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, there was no going back. The connection between us had already been made, and it was impossible to deny any longer. A few days passed, but the tension didn't go away. It lingered in the spaces between words, in the silences that stretched too long. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the balcony, his words, the way they cut right through me. I kept trying to tell myself it was just a fluke, that I could push it all aside. But Ryan's presence kept creeping into my thoughts, and the more I tried to avoid him, the more my mind seemed to pull me back. It wasn't until he showed up at the house again that I knew there was no escaping it. "He came by to help with the car," he said. But I knew better. There was always something more behind his visits, something unspoken that neither of us could ignore. The house was quiet when he arrived, and Emily was busy in the other room. Ryan moved through the space with an easy, familiar confidence, and I couldn't help but notice how at ease he seemed in my home. He was fixing something under the hood of the car, and I stood by the kitchen window, watching him through the glass. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, the way his hands worked with such precision. I should have gone back inside, kept busy, but my feet wouldn't move. My body felt anchored to that spot, drawn to him in a way I didn't understand. He caught my gaze, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, heavy, like it was charged with an electric current. He didn't break the silence. He just watched me, and in that moment, I couldn't look away. Finally, he stood up and wiped his hands on a rag, stepping toward the door. "Everything's good," he said casually, but his voice was different now, quieter, like he knew something had shifted between us. I nodded, forcing myself to smile. "Thanks for helping." Ryan stood in the doorway, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, without a word, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine as he passed. The touch was so light, so subtle, but it felt like a jolt of electricity running through my body. I froze, my heart racing. I pulled my hand back quickly, but it was too late. He felt it too. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, and just like that, the line had been crossed. Neither of us said anything. There didn't need to be words. We both knew that what had just happened couldn't be undone. I stood there in the kitchen, my breath shallow, the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears. Everything around me felt distant, like the world had blurred into the background. The only thing I could focus on was the pull between us, undeniable, relentless. I tried to pretend it didn't matter, but deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to go back to my normal life, to act like nothing had changed. I went through the motions, cooking dinner, talking to Emily, making small talk with friends, even laughing at the right moments. But no matter how hard I tried to settle back into my routine, there was a constant undercurrent I couldn't escape. It was in the way I looked at Emily, how everything felt slightly off, like the world was being viewed through a foggy window. Ryan's presence lingered. Every time I was with Emily, I could feel it, an unspoken weight in the air. It wasn't just that I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was the way everything seemed to have changed. Even the simplest moments felt tainted. I caught myself staring off into space, wondering what Ryan was doing, or remembering the way his hand brushed mine, so lightly, but with a force that left me shaken. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of weakness. But I knew it was more than that. I avoided Ryan for a while. When I saw his name on my phone, I'd ignore his messages. When he came by to visit Emily, I found excuses to stay out of the house. But it only made things worse. The more I distanced myself, the stronger the pull became. It was like I was trying to run away from something that was chasing me, and the harder I ran, the faster it seemed to catch up. Then one evening, I found myself alone at the house. Emily had gone out with some friends, and I was left to myself. My mind kept circling back to Ryan, to the quiet moments when I couldn't stop thinking about him. I knew I should ignore the feeling, but it felt too strong, too real to just dismiss. When the doorbell rang, I knew instantly who it was. No one else ever came over unannounced. It was Ryan. I froze for a moment, standing in the hallway, my heart racing. I should have turned him away. I should have told him I wasn't in the mood to see anyone. But instead, I walked to the door and opened it. Ryan was standing there, a half-smile playing on his lips, like he knew exactly what he was doing. "I know you're avoiding me," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. "But I thought we should talk." I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell him to leave, to tell him I didn't want this, that we had to stop this before it went too far. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. There was something about the way he stood there, so confident, so sure of himself, that made it feel like there was no way out anymore. "I think we both know this isn't just about avoiding each other," he said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving mine. And in that moment, I knew he was right. Ryan's voice was low, filled with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated me. He took a step closer, and I felt that familiar pull again, like gravity itself was shifting beneath my feet. I wanted to run, to turn and walk away, but my body wouldn't let me. I stood frozen, feeling his presence wrap around me, filling the space until there was no room left to breathe. I couldn't go back now. I could feel the inevitability in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Every encounter with him felt like a slow unraveling, like the world I had known was slipping through my fingers. The tension had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about stolen glances or fleeting touches anymore. It had become something far more consuming, far more dangerous. That night, when Ryan came over, there was no more pretending. We exchanged a few words at the door, but the silence between us was suffocating. Neither of us could deny it any longer. I could see it in his eyes, the same hunger, the same desire I had been trying so hard to suppress. The moment he stepped inside, the air between us thickened, charged with a raw energy neither of us could resist. We didn't talk much. It wasn't necessary. We had already crossed the line, and everything after that felt like a continuation of something we had both been fighting for weeks. He closed the door behind him, and I didn't move. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, drawn to him by something I couldn't explain. He reached for me, his hand brushing mine again, and this time, there was no hesitation. I didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his breath warm against my skin. "I told you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't something we can ignore." I wanted to say something, to stop this madness, to push him away and remind myself of who I was, of who I had promised to be. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for him, and in that instant, everything else ceased to exist. The kiss was hesitant at first, like we were both testing the waters, unsure if we could handle what we were about to do. But once it deepened, once we both gave in to the inevitable, it was no longer hesitant. It was wild, desperate, like we had been holding our breath for too long and could no longer wait to release it. I could feel his hands on me, his touch as urgent as my own. We stumbled toward the living room, too caught up in the moment to care about anything else. The walls between us, the unspoken roles I had lived by, all shattered in that instant. There was no going back now. We were too far gone. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for breath, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We both knew what had just happened. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken understanding, but there was no turning back. The path we were on was clear now, and I knew that no matter how hard I tried, I wouldn't be able to stop. Neither of us could. Ryan's gaze met mine, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't something we could walk away from. Not anymore. "I won't stop," he whispered, his voice a promise and a challenge. "Neither would I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Each day now felt like a slow electric current running through me. I could feel it in every conversation with Emily, in every smile I forced, in every gesture that was supposed to be casual but felt like a lie. The game we had started, the one I had tried so hard to deny, had become something much bigger than I could have ever anticipated. When I was with Emily, there was this constant ache in my chest. The moments when we laughed together, when we held hands, felt hollow. I tried to enjoy them, tried to convince myself that everything was still the same. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Ryan's presence was never far away, a constant shadow in my thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about him, the way his touch made everything else feel insignificant, the way he had somehow crawled into every waking moment. It was like living in two worlds. One was with Emily, the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. The other was with Ryan, whose very name seemed to set something inside me on fire. I couldn't control the pull anymore. Every time I saw Ryan, every time he touched me, I was reminded of how alive I felt. And every time I stepped away, every time I forced myself back into my normal life, it felt like I was suffocating. The worst part was that I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't go on like this forever. But the temptation, the raw need, was too powerful to ignore. There were times when I'd find myself waiting for Ryan's texts, when I'd hear the familiar knock at the door and my heart would skip a beat. I tried to resist, but every time he came, every time we were alone, I knew what would happen. It had become inevitable. One evening, when Emily was out on a business trip, I found myself alone in the house again. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforted me. It was the kind that echoed with the knowledge of what was to come. My phone buzzed. It was Ryan. "Are you alone?" the message read. I stared at it for a moment, my heart pounding. I knew what he was asking. I knew what he wanted. And a part of me wanted it too, desperately. I texted back, my fingers trembling as I typed. Yes. It wasn't long before there was a soft knock on the door. I didn't even hesitate. I opened it, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his gaze intense. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence filled the space, pulling me in like gravity. Without a word, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His hand found mine, and the moment our fingers touched, I knew. It was like every other thought in my head vanished, and all that was left was him, the desire, the need, the undeniable connection that had started weeks ago. It had grown into something unstoppable. I told you I wouldn't stop, Ryan whispered, his lips brushing against my ear as he pulled me closer. And he didn't. Neither of us did. We were caught in this dangerous game now, and it felt as though we were sinking deeper with every passing second. The weight of what we had done pulled us further down into a place we couldn't escape. With each minute that ticked by, the air grew thicker, the burden heavier. There was no way to undo the damage we had caused, no way to take back the choices we had made. We had crossed a line that, once crossed, left no room for retreat. And deep down, I knew it was too late to turn back. Too late to fix what had been broken. And honestly, a part of me didn't even want to go back. I did everything I always had, everything that seemed necessary to keep the illusion intact, even as the world inside me fell apart. But within me, it was like I was trapped between two worlds. One where I was still married to Emily, still the man she thought I was, and another where Ryan's presence consumed me entirely. It wasn't just a fleeting distraction anymore. It was an all-encompassing force that claimed my every thought, my every waking moment. I couldn't keep up the pretense much longer. The guilt that gnawed at me during every quiet moment, the shame that coursed through me every time I met Emily's eyes, had grown unbearable. It was like I was carrying a weight so heavy that every breath became a struggle. The stolen glances I shared with Ryan, the secret smiles, the unspoken things between us, each one added another layer to the lie I was living. I had reached a breaking point, and I knew deep down that something had to give. I could no longer continue to live this lie, to play the part of someone I wasn't. I had to face the truth. But as much as I knew I couldn't keep going, I also knew there was no turning back. What Ryan and I had, whatever it was, had grown so deep, so real, that I could no longer deny it. It had taken root in me, in the deepest parts of me, and I wasn't sure I even wanted to let it go. The truth was, I hadn't wanted to stop. Not really. Everything we shared had felt too intense, too real, to ignore. One evening, when the weight of it all became too much to carry, I found myself at a small cafe, quiet and tucked away from the world and all its complications. I told Ryan to meet me there, knowing that this would be our moment, the moment when everything would finally be laid bare. It would be the turning point, the decision that would change everything. When Ryan walked in, the world seemed to narrow, and all my thoughts seemed to freeze. His gaze locked with mine instantly. There was no need for words between us. I could see it in his eyes, the understanding, the shared awareness that what we had started could never be undone. The moment had arrived, and we both knew it. He sat across from me, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other. It was as if time had stopped, as if the world outside no longer mattered. All that mattered was what hung between us, our truth, our choices, the undeniable fact that we had crossed a line. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But in that small cafe, it felt as if it reverberated through the air. I can't keep pretending. I can't keep trying to hold it all together when it's already fallen apart. Ryan's eyes softened, and for a moment, his gaze seemed to hold a tenderness that matched the weight of my words. He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but calm, as though he had been expecting this, as though he had been waiting for me to say it. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice low but steady. But I knew from the moment we first locked eyes that there was no way we could walk away from this. Not once it started. The truth settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. I swallowed hard, the weight of it pressing down on me. "I don't want to hurt Emily," I said, my voice trembling with the mix of guilt and truth I could no longer suppress. "But I don't know how to stop this. I don't know if I even want to stop it. Ryan reached across the table then, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch, simple and fleeting, felt like everything in that one brief moment. The rest of the world faded away. There was no past, no future, only this, the undeniable connection that had formed between us. I don't think either of us can stop now, he said softly, his voice full of quiet certainty. We've crossed the line, and it's too late to go back. All that's left now is to face it.